I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Just for a moment, let's just bring back to mind also, right, that since we're in this section on emptiness, wisdom, special insight, that's directly connected to our motivation of love, and especially compassion. Because as Lama Tsongkhapa in the text we're studying says, very clearly, ignorance is the main cause, according to Buddhism, of our own suffering and the suffering of others. You look at the 12 links of dependent origination that give rise to suffering. Ignorance is the first link. And so Lama Tsongkhapa points out, right, the only way, from a Buddhist perspective, right, the only way to ultimately free ourselves and free others from suffering is by overcoming ignorance. The only way to do that is through wisdom. So studying emptiness is directly related to that motivation, especially of compassion, wishing to free ourselves and others from suffering. Then we'll return to Lama Tsongkhapa's text, and for those who have the text and are following, we're on the lower part of page 266. And so, we've recently finished like a long section on how to meditate on the selflessness or emptiness of persons, meaning yourself. Right? And now we're in a section on meditating on the selflessness of phenomena. Phenomena being something other than yourself. Right? So and remember, phenomena could mean external things like houses and cars and so on. But it also could mean like your own mind, your own body, and phenomena that are part of your own continuum, you could say. And so, and we're just about to begin the section at the bottom here where it says, a refutation. So here refutation means refutation of inherent existence or true existence, right? By another reason not explained earlier. So he's going to start explaining a new reason, a new line of reasoning for understanding emptiness. And then he says, the last heading at the bottom of 266, presenting the argument of interdependence. And I think maybe a better translation might be dependent arising. Or some people, Bob Thurman translates it relativity. It's a unique translation, but I think dependent arising is a useful translation for our context. And so there'll be 10 points and so on. I'll make a brief comment. Like, they sometimes say that dependent arising, and we'll get into why they would say this, but is the king of reasons, they sometimes say, for understanding emptiness. The most important of all reasonings. So the first of the 10 points that Lama Tsongkhapa begins with is, call it the Zhijang Rinpoche's headings call it citation of sources. But here it's some quotations from sutras, right? And this is, for those who've been following the text, this is typical, isn't it, of Lama Tsongkhapa. He's very clear that he's not, what's the word, not making something up himself, right? So he quotes, first of all, the Buddha, usually, and you'll see he does that in this section, because he does in so many sections, right? He'll start off by quoting the Buddha, the actual sutras, then he'll quote Indian masters, and then explain, right? So he's making it clear he's not just putting his own theory. So the first sutra he quotes is the sutra requested by Sagaramati, which says, those which originate interdependently do not exist by way of their own entity. Then he says, inherent establishment is clearly refuted with the sign of dependent arising. Here, the word sign, just to be clear, they mean like it's an interesting word choice, but what it means is like the logical sign, so reason. So sign means reason in this context, right? Which is a term actually from Buddhist debate and Buddhist logic, right? So you apply a reason or a sign to prove a thesis. So in this case, the thesis is essentially, what's the thesis? The thesis is the thing to be proven. In other words, is things do not exist by way of their own entity, and the sign is because why? Because they originate interdependently, or because they're dependently arisen. In one sense, actually, I just want to pause there, right? In one sense, that couldn't be simpler, could it? Like, in other words, and sometimes if you want to, like when you're, like we're going to get into a lot of detail here with Lama Tsongkhapa, right? But sometimes when you want to just present this in a very simplistic way, you could say things don't exist independently because they arise dependently, right? And that's quite clear, isn't it? It'll be hard to debate against that, to say, but what does that mean, right? So we're going to get, and actually, it's interesting, because in one way it seems quite simple, but of course, according to Lama Tsongkhapa, if you realize the actual deep meaning of that, you've realized emptiness, right? So, so simple and it's not simple, I guess. But so he's saying that's a logical reason, right? So here, I said, well, actually, how did I say, things don't exist independently because they arise dependently. Right? But here he doesn't say things don't exist. The Buddha doesn't say things don't exist independently. He says they do not exist by way of their own entity. As we'll see, existing by way of his own entity would imply independence. So we'll have to understand that in more detail. But then Lama Tsongkhapa goes on to quote another sutra, the sutra requested by the Naga king Anavatapta. Which said, and there are different translations of this verse, and I sort of was comparing them as I was preparing. So it says, one way of putting the first line is, whatever, the way they have it here, whatever is born from conditions is not born. Or another way of saying it is, whatever is produced from conditions is unproduced. Sometimes you see that phrase, unproduced. It is not produced by way of its own entity, or not born by way of its own entity. Whatever depends on conditions is said to be empty. Whoever has realized emptiness is aware, or is conscientious. I think aware is a better word. So let's look at, that's an interesting one, right? Whatever is born from conditions is unborn. Later we're going to get it, Lama Tsongkhapa is going to go into great detail, so I just want to mention something here. These passages, actually I want to say a few things. One is, sometimes people read them and they just think, oh, the Buddha is just being, what's the word, like, enigmatic, or, trying to, so, and actually some people interpret these as if the Buddha is, like, trying to just, be paradoxical, and that you would go, oh, wow, like, that blows my mind, or something. And Lama Tsongkhapa, as if therefore, like, you should, some people almost interpret it that way, right? Like, well, it's hard to make sense of that, so it's so that just stop thinking or something. Go beyond your mind, or some people interpret a verse like that way. And Lama Tsongkhapa says that's a wrong interpretation, right? And maybe I should wait, but I'll just say a little bit here, right? Because what he's saying is, you have to understand what he means by whatever is born, and you have to understand what he means by unborn, right? And if you don't, you'll wind up misinterpreting the Buddha's intent. That's what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying. Later, he goes into great detail, making this whole point about you have to differentiate between, on the one hand, inherent existence, or existence by way of its own entity, as it's being put here, and simple existence, or existence in general. Right? And then he also says you have to differentiate between complete non-existence and non-existence by way of its own entity. And so that's what's being gotten at here. Right? So if we say whatever is born from causes and conditions is not born by way of its own entity, you could say it that way. That's what the Buddha is saying there, right? If it's born due to causes and conditions, so because if you were to say, like, well, I was born from my parents, so I was never born. That's not what it's saying. But the thing is, if you were born independent of your parents, you don't exist by way of your own entity. You don't exist independently. You don't exist inherently. So we have to be quite precise and understand these verses. And this is why Lama Tsongkhapa goes into great detail, is that many times they're misunderstood. That's why Lama Tsongkhapa goes into great detail explaining the meaning of them. Right. So whatever is produced from conditions is unproduced, right, by way of its own entity. It is not. That's what he's saying. It is unproduced, or is unborn or unproduced by way of its own entity. Whatever depends on conditions is said to be empty. Not empty of any kind of existence at all, but empty of intrinsic existence. And whoever has realized this is aware. Right? Means free, actually, isn't it? Means liberated from suffering. And then Lama Tsongkhapa says, this is said frequently in the precious scriptures. And actually it's true, like you can find many, many other scriptural passages from the Buddha that say the same thing. So now Lama Tsongkhapa says, explanation of what the sutra quote means. He says the meaning of what the first line refers to as not born is explained by the second line, saying not born by way of its own entity, which is what we were just saying, right? Doesn't mean not born at all, right? But it means not born by way of its own entity. Then he says, therefore, a qualification of the object of negation is applied to the refutation of birth. In the Descent to Lanka, the Lankavatara Sutra, quoted in Chandrakirti's clear words, it says, thinking of their not being born inherently, I said, all phenomena are unborn. And actually, I just want to pause here and make this point, again, in a different way. Like, because Lama Tsongkhapa points this kind of thing out, right? He'll point out, like, in the Lankavatara Sutra, it says not born inherently. And then it says, then there are going to be other places where the Buddha says not born. You have to remember that means inherently. Right? And the same thing, like, there are many passages, like in the Prajnaparamita, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, there are many passages where it says, like, if you read the Heart Sutra, no eyes, no ears, no nose, no tongue. And then, every now and then in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, the Buddha will say something like inherently, or intrinsically. And Lama Tsongkhapa was pointing out, you have to apply that to all those other, in your understanding, you apply that to all the other sentences. And this is quite important, actually, because I remember this happens, actually. I remember one time I was having a conversation with a good friend, and he was saying, well, he was saying this to me, actually. He was saying, well, I was studying emptiness, and it says there's no feeling, no perception, no, that's all in the Heart Sutra, right? And he said, the reality is I feel. He said, I feel pain, and then he said, and I perceive, whatever, I perceive this and I perceive that, and then I feel good about this one and bad about that one. So what the hell is it talking about? And it was that nobody had mentioned to him you apply that inherently or intrinsically. Nobody had said that phrase that Lama Tsongkhapa was pointing out. And so in the past, then he was saying, well, that contradicts my direct experience, right? So Lama Tsongkhapa was pointing this out. And if you were to say, somebody has a baby and you would say your baby was never born, that's ludicrous, right? But here is making a philosophical point, right? So we have to apply that phrase. Does that make sense? Otherwise, you're going to misunderstand the passages. And then he continues to quote Chandrakirti here, explaining, for fear that without a qualification having been made, his statements that birth does not exist could be held to indicate that all birth whatsoever is non-existent, the teacher, meaning the Buddha himself, took up the thought of the sutras and explained the meaning of the non-inherent existence, or non-existence of inherent birth. You could say non-inherent existence of birth. Right? So you get the point there. He's not saying there's no such thing as birth whatsoever. He's saying there's no inherently existent birth. And we've talked before about what that means, and we're going to talk again about what that means. But he's clarifying here for the sake of understanding the scripture. Then he says, then the third line, right? The third line above, which says, whatever depends on conditions is said to be empty. So he's saying, the third line that says, dependence and reliance on conditions is the meaning of being empty of establishment by way of his own entity. This indicates that emptiness of inherent establishment is the meaning of dependent arising, whereas an emptiness performing functions that would negate mere birth is not. Right, so another point he's making here is, and which he's emphasized so much, hasn't he? and pause again just to remind people of this. What he's getting at is what's the object of negation, right? Because Lama Tsongkhapa always says if you're going to meditate on emptiness, you have to first know what are you negating, right? Empty of something, right? What's it empty of? And Lama Tsongkhapa over and over again says if you get the wrong object of negation, then you wind up falling into eternalism or nihilism, right? And so here it would be nihilism, wouldn't it? So he's saying, in other words, if you think you're refuting, when you're refuting emptiness, if your object of negation were things performing functions, right, being able to perform the functions they perform, you would wind up nihilistic, wouldn't you? In other words, if you thought, I'm negating that causes lead to effects, that's nihilism, And so he's saying that's not what's to be negated. So what's to be negated then is inherent establishment. Which is quite interesting, isn't it? Inherent establishment. Establishment from its own side, you'd say. That's what, so he's saying mere birth is not being refuted, right? Functionality is not being refuted. Causality is not being refuted. What's being refuted is, I'll just use his phrase, right? Inherent establishment, right? And he's saying, how is inherent establishment refuted? Through the meaning of dependent arising. Right? Sometimes they'll say, dependent arising and emptiness are synonyms. They have the same meaning. So then he quotes Nagarjuna, his root text in Wisdom, that says, that which arises in dependence, right, or that which is dependently arisen, is, I think a better translation of the second line from another translator is pacified of inherent existence. Right, so that which arises dependently is empty of or pacified of inherent existence. So he's pointing out, you can see now, and you could also, he's again, the very beginning of the section on emptiness, he pointed out that he was going to follow the tradition that comes from the Buddha, through Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti. And that's precisely what he's doing here. So by the reason of the arising dependently, it is pacified or empty of establishment by way of its own entity. You should know that whatever obscure fabrications have been propounded, that because of dependent arising itself, the Madhyamaka system must propound non-arising and so forth, are thereby cleared away. And so what he's saying is, some people, and it's true actually, this was true in Lama Tsongkhapa's time, and it's still true now. You can find books like this, actually, I've said this before. But that seem to assert the Tibetans did this, but Westerners do the same thing, where they assert that Nagarjuna's doctrine and the doctrine of the Madhyamakas is that things are, what's the word? Are empty of existing, actually. And Lama Tsongkhapa is saying here, well, if Nagarjuna's main line of reasoning is dependent arising, well, arising has arising in it, right? So if the main reason is dependent arising, how can you say, I'm using the reasoning that things have arisen dependently to say they don't exist at all? He says you can already see that's completely a fabrication, a misunderstanding. And he's quoting, he's saying, if Nagarjuna himself has pointed out, right, dependent arising is the reason, then he can't be refuting functionality because arising is a function, right, is a functional phenomenon. And that what's being found to be empty is inherent establishment, inherent existence. Okay, and then we turn to the next page here. So then he says, the argument of dependent arising, which is like that, is praised very much. Again, he quotes the sutra requested by the Naga king Anavatapta. I prefer a different, I don't like this word experts there. I think better translation is the wise. Another translator used that, and I think it's nice. Or the skillful. So I'll say the wise see dharmas arise in dependence, or arise dependently. They do not at all depend on extreme views. Through realizing dependent arising as it is, one does not depend on views holding to extremes. The meaning of this is set forth in Chandrakirti's commentary on the Middle Way, or supplements in the Middle Way. Since things arise in utter mutual dependence, these conceptions cannot be imputed. Through this reasoning of dependent arising, the net of all bad views is therefore cut. This is the unexcelled distinguishing feature of the Mahatma Nagarjuna, the father and his spiritual son, meaning Aryadeva. That is why, from among the various reasonings, I will describe that of dependent arising here. So what's he saying? He's saying that, and I want to be clear what he's saying, the net of all bad views. He's going to get into this more below, but in brief, what he's saying is, that when you're trying to understand emptiness, there are two main extremes that you could fall into. Eternalism, right, or inherent establishment, you could say, or nihilism. He's saying dependent arising cuts off both. And well, he says it just below, so maybe I'll just continue on and I'll explain it there in the next paragraph. He says, here there are two main obstacles, places where the pure view goes wrong. One is the view of permanence and superimposition, which has the object aim of the apprehension of true existence, apprehending phenomena as truly existent. Right? So this is quite interesting, right? I was just saying that, but the two flaws, the first one he's saying, is the view of permanence, right? The two extremes, right? So the first one is permanence. And then he says superimposition, which is an interesting term, right? You call it projection, right? So that's where you're adding, superimposing, right? You're adding something to phenomena that's not really there. Right? Because what he's trying to get is wisdom. Wisdom sees things as they are. So the first flaw is where you add things to phenomena. And as we've talked about before, here it's adding something very specific, which is true existence or inherent establishment. Right? Then we can add all other kinds of things. Yeah. And we said that once you add true existence, you inevitably and without any control do add other things, right? Because once you think you truly exist and objects truly exist, then you add. This is attractive, this is unattractive, this is good, this is bad, this is ugly, this is beautiful, and so on. And so that's all superimposition, right? So it's where you're adding something on to phenomena, right? Then the second one, right, is the view of annihilation and deprecation, right? So deprecation is the opposite of superimposition. That's where you're deprecating meaning you're denying that something's there that is there, right? Like so something is existent, but deprecating means you're telling yourself or believing or kind of denying that it exists, right? So that's the view of annihilation or nihilism, which is said to be the more, both, it's actually interesting. They sometimes, they say nihilism actually is the more dangerous of the two in the sense that either of you stops you from becoming liberated, right? Superimposition or deprecation, both stop you from realizing emptiness and becoming liberated. But they say if you go towards nihilism, then you deny functionality of things, right? And then that leads to a kind of over time that leads a person to no longer be ethical. Right? So that's why it's even a worse view. Whereas the view of permanence is an obstacle to liberation, right? It's an obstacle to understanding emptiness. But if you kind of believe in superimposition in the sense of if you believe it in the sense of I really exist and therefore I'll suffer, so I don't want to do something bad. You kind of, with a kind of self-grasping, but if out of that you become ethical, at least you're not hurting people. So they're both kind of wrong views, but one is more dangerous than the other. Yeah, that's why Nagarjuna sometimes says, if you grasp, he has this metaphor, Nagarjuna, his name even, right, Naga is in there, which means like serpent, right? Mm-hmm. And he uses this metaphor. He says, if you understand emptiness wrongly, it's like grabbing a snake at the wrong place. in India, you know, it's cobras. And I've seen, well, actually, I've seen pictures of this, and Tashi was telling me at the monastery they sometimes have to do that. The cobra will come in the house and they have to catch it and take it out. And he said, oh, it's no big deal. You just catch it behind the head and carry it out. Or you put it in, you know, grab it with a stick or something. But Nagarjuna, so they do that in India, right? So that Nagarjuna was saying, if you grab the snake too far down from the head, it'll turn and bite you. And he says that's like nihilism. That's like trying to grasp emptiness in the wrong way. You'll end up being worse off. So Nagarjuna says, so don't do that. You know, don't grasp the doctrine of emptiness as if it's nihilism, because that would be an incorrect view that would harm you. Anyway, so and here he says, this is an interesting point, right, which I was mentioning earlier. Deprecation. So then he says, the measure of the object of negation has not been delimited and becomes excessive. Right, so there, what does he mean? You're not, that person who does that, they use the reasonings taught, right, but they haven't correctly identified the object of negation. So they think they're negating functionality. They think they're negating mere existence, which is incorrect, right? You're only negating inherent existence or inherent establishment. And if you wrongly, or if you, in the Lamrim Chenmo, the great treatise on the Sage's Path, Lama Tsongkhapa goes into a lot of detail about, you know, how not to have too broad or too tight, or too narrow, rather, an identification of the object of negation. And here he's mentioning it also, that we have to identify that correctly. Remember, like sometimes, you know, that's why, like, Yume Kensho Rinpoche often, a number of times, has pointed this out, that, you know, the most important, most difficult part of meditation on emptiness, experientially, is correctly identifying the object of negation. And he told that famous story of Gampopa's disciple, right? What's his name? Who was the founder of the Drikung school, the Drikung Kagyu school. Anyway, he...
Is it Tilopa?
Oh, no, Tilopa was Norpa's teacher, and then there was Marpa, then Milarepa, Gampopa, and then Pagmo Drupa. That was it, Pagmo Drupa, who was a great Kagyu master. But, so Pagmo Drupa, the story was that he went all over Tibet. Like, he was this great, kind of, you know, very good spiritual practitioner. And he went all over Tibet asking people, what's the object of negation? And he would ask one master after another. He just like traveled around, right? And so he spent a few years actually at Sakya. I read some detail about that, where he spent a number of years at Sakya and received like the whole Lamdre teachings. But he kept asking, what's the object of negation? And he hadn't yet realized emptiness. So even though he was a great tantric master, and you know, I guess we realized bodhicitta, he hadn't yet realized emptiness. So, and so finally he came to Gampopa, and I guess Gampopa said something to him like, everything you've experienced up to now, or something, and he fainted. But after that, he was able to realize the object of negation. Somehow it fit his mind to say that. But so the point is, we have to correctly identify it, you know, and so we have to do that through experience. He says. So then he says, if you, what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying here, this last sentence, he's saying, if you fall into either superimposition, right, meaning permanence, or deprecation, meaning nihilism, he says, then it becomes impossible to induce the ascertainment of dependently arising causes and effects in one's own system, so there is no way to identify something that is this and not that. You know, and if somebody reaches that place, right, where they, and I actually, again, I'll just share, like, I've talked to people like that, where they say, oh, I've been reading about emptiness, and like, everything's one. And you say, that's not, you don't have to say that's not the meaning of emptiness, actually, right? There's a whole line of reasoning will come later, not one and not many. So if you think, if you come to the conclusion everything's one, you've misunderstood emptiness, right? Everything's not oneness, right? I think sometimes can say everything's one paste in the sense that everything's empty, but it's not all one, right? Because you have to be able to, you still have to be able to posit causes and conditions. Otherwise, how can you use the line of dependent arising if you can't understand that things arise dependently, right? And if things arise dependently, they have to be interrelated. So that's one point. And then another point I wanted to make is this word dependent arising is very, this is why I like that translation of that word. Part of the reason they sometimes say this, and I just want to go through it a little bit, is dependent, right? The word dependent, that part of it, refutes inherent existence, right? If something's dependent, it doesn't exist intrinsically, on its own, self-established. And then arising, though, right, includes arising. So if something arises, right, that means it's not completely non-existent. So that refutes, so actually just the phrase dependent arising, right? Dependent refutes superposition. And arising refutes deprecation, right? So just the phrase dependent arising, this is part of the profundity of dependent arising in terms of that last paragraph, right? Just the phrase dependent arising, if you understand it correctly, it refutes the two extremes. And that's why it's said to be a particularly important line of reasoning, because other lines of reasoning by themselves don't refute both. They'll refute one, but then you have to use another reason to refute the other. Dependent arising simultaneously refutes both mistakes, so to speak. So I think then he says, when inherent establishment is negated with a reason inducing the ascertainment that from such and such causes and conditions such and such effects arise, those two are abandoned without remainder. So that's what he's saying. He's just saying what I just said. That when you understand, because the dependent refutes inherent establishment, and the arising refutes nihilism. So he says, the view of annihilation is radically negated, right? The arising refutes annihilation. Right? And through ascertaining the meaning of the thesis, meaning dependence, permanence is radically negated. So that's very profound, isn't it? Just this phrase, dependent arising. This is why His Holiness Dalai Lama, I've said that before, sometimes His Holiness Dalai Lama says, if Buddhists were to have like a slogan for Buddhism, it would be dependent arising. Which is quite funny, I think. Because it refutes both extremes. And because and it's a synonym for emptiness. But the word emptiness by itself doesn't necessarily doesn't in and of itself, unless you understand it correctly, but the word by itself wouldn't refute nihilism. Dependent arising refutes both in one phrase. Any questions up to that point? Yeah.
So, when it says superimposition, is there anything that if we say something is beautiful or something is ugly, any mere association of, oh, that's pretty, is a superimposition? Or is that an exaggeration in this context?
Well, first of all, in this, I should clarify, in this particular context, he's talking about a very specific type of superimposition, because there are an infinite number of possible superimpositions, right? We can superimpose all kinds of things, right? So I want to give a two-part answer to your question. The first part would be, in this very specific context, he says it. He says, here the specific superimposition being addressed is true existence or inherent establishment. So he's saying here we're specifically talking about that kind of superimposition. And then I guess it's an interesting question you're raising, though, I think. So that's the direct question answer in terms of this passage. But then I think your question raises an interesting point, right, which is, so to say this right, like, because conventionally, right, if we want to differentiate conventional and ultimate levels of truth, conventionally there are such things as beauty or value, and you could go or like all kinds of things, right? Size, gender, culture, all those things. So we can't say those are all, so it's an interesting question, right? Those do exist conventionally. So we can't say those are wrong, right? But part of what I think is being gotten at, this is not what he's saying here, but just to take it, to answer your question a little more, I think one way of thinking about it is this, is, you know, in one way we know this, right? Like, I'll give an example, like, the superimposition, in a sense, in that sense, which is not what he's talking about, but I just to answer your question. Like, let's say I'm with a group of, like, if I'm with a group of people who are all, who are mostly like 5'2", I'm 6 feet, right? So then I would think, oh, I'm quite tall, right? And then if I'm with a group of NBA basketball players, I would think, oh, I'm really short. And both of those, in each of those contexts, are correct statements, right? Like, in this group of people where the average height is 5'2", I'm quite tall. Then when I'm with a group of basketball players, oh, I'm extremely short, right? And those are conventionally valid uses of language, you could say, right? But if I believe, like, if when I'm with a group of people who are shorter than me, and I think, oh, and I start to believe that I'm truly tall, inherently tall, intrinsically tall, really tall from my own side, and I develop a kind of self-image of that, that's a superposition. I'm not recognizing it's just a label that's dependently or isn't dependent upon causes and conditions. You see what I'm getting at? And so if I can recognize that whatever label I'm using is just a label that's arisen, and if it's correct, is arisen correctly due to causes and conditions. But it's in a context, it depends upon that context, I'm not that from my own side in that, or whatever, then it's not a superimposition, it's just a label, right? It's a correct label. But if I believe it's true intrinsically, you know, then I might be very disappointed when I hang out with some basketball players and suddenly I feel very, like, upset, you know, or something like that. You know, and so that's that part, right? The same thing with like you know, in other words, I'll give you an example, like, then actually it's the same point, I'll just make the same point, like, it's like, and I think lately it's been interesting that way, like, what's this, right? Like, and there are actually examples of this in ancient Buddhist scriptures, though, around gender, for example, right? Where there was, on the one hand, because he's talking about functionality, right? So if somebody wants to have a child, and they say, well, you know, let's say there's a woman who says, I want to have a child, so I'm looking for a man to, you know, to get pregnant. Well, there's a functional, conventional validity to that, and, you know, there's a functionality, right? But then when we hold on to that as if it's inherently exists and not dependent upon causes and conditions, right? Then you can see sometimes when somebody says, like, for example, if somebody comes to their parents and says, I'm transgender, and the parent, like, almost faints, like, or freaks out, right? Like, because they were holding on to a very clear, you know, they felt, no, you're that from your own side, intrinsically. And I'm not making a political comment here, I'm just saying, that's an example where you can see, like, how when we hold on to a certain concept as if it's truly existent, that's a superimposition, right? Whereas we recognize, well, it's, you know, it's a label based upon causes and conditions, like all labels are. You know, and that applies to all of them, beauty and ugly and tall and short and skinny and fat, and every kind of label are dependently arisen, and they're all relative, right? And so the superimposition is when we think they exist from their own side. Does that kind of make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Any other questions?
But also ascribing meaning to that reality. So if you say you're tall, which is demonstrably true, but you could be ascribing tallness as a virtue beyond what it's descriptive of. So the Lama always used to talk about the exaggeration, the main point being the exaggeration of the reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Which we do, don't we? Yeah, we like, yeah, there are so many ways in which we add different meanings to different things. Okay, so the next, okay, so now he says the presentation of dependent arising, and he makes, he's going to give two different presentations here. The first is one, he says, presentation shared with Chittamatra. So that's a presentation that Madhyamikas accept, but that also, that Chittamatra, so Chittamatra is another philosophical school, right? Another Mahayana Buddhist philosophical school. Sometimes translated as mind only. Chittamatra, they usually translate as mind only, that phrase, that word. So here it says, therefore external things such as sprouts and internal things such as compositional factors originate gradually in dependence upon seeds and so forth, and ignorance and so forth, respectively. Right. So this first level or type of dependent arising that he's talking about here is dependence upon causes and conditions. And he's saying external things depend upon causes and conditions, which we know, right? You plant, in other words, if you want to have peas, you plant peas. If you want to have tomatoes, you plant tomatoes, and so on. And then internal things also, right? And we know that also, right? So for example, and what he's getting at there is, for example, if you, if you cultivate anger, right? Whereas if you start getting, if you habituate yourself to anger, then you're going to become more and more angry. Right? If you habituate yourself, that's causality, right? On the other hand, if you, and actually, if you habituate yourself to a peaceful mind, then you're more likely to have a peaceful mind, right? And the more you do that, the more your internal state will go in the direction of whatever you're habituating yourself to. So he's saying one level of dependent arising is this kind of recognition that things depend upon specific causes, right? And their corresponding causes. And he's saying, actually, really, all Buddhists accept that. Right? That's a common to all Buddhist schools. Then he's saying, then there's a unique, uncommon presentation of dependent arising that's specific to Madhyamaka school. And there he says, if that is so, their establishment through their own character is inadmissible, because if they were established through their own entities, they would necessarily be established for themselves, through their own independent, self-sustaining, inherent existence. So their dependence upon causes and conditions would be contradictory. Then he quotes R.A. Davis Forger's stanzas. That which has a dependent origin does not have its independence. That was that phrase, the reason I gave earlier. All of these don't have independence, hence the self does not exist. Through this, you should understand that since persons and pots and the like are also imputed independence upon their collections of parts, they do not have inherent establishment. So here, he's getting at a subtler kind of dependent origination, right? And actually, you could think of, there are actually, ordinarily it's taught there are three levels of dependent arising. Or three, levels or types of dependent arising. The first is the grossest, which is dependent upon causes and conditions. That's what we've already mentioned, right? Then it comes next, what he says here, dependent upon parts. So that's different, isn't it? Like, in other words, that a thing depends not just on its external, like cause and conditions could be like your body depends upon your parents, right? Parts means it also depends upon all the organs and so on. And then there's a third type of dependent origination, which is label, right, or designation. So your body exists as a body because it's labeled body. Right? And so the point being, there are three different levels of dependent origination, and what he's getting at here is that the last two, right, dependence upon parts and dependent upon a label, those are uniquely explained in the Madhyamaka system. Does that make sense? Pause for a second. And there's, I guess, one more point there I'll just make and then pause, is so he's pointing out actually though that, and actually really though, from a Majamaka perspective, right, if things have, actually first of all phenomena have, first of all, from a Majamaka perspective, all phenomena are dependently originated, dependent arising. Second, not all phenomena depend upon causes and conditions, but all phenomena depend upon parts and labels. Let's see if this is right. And I guess what I was going to say is, what he's getting at here, there's this phrase that they sometimes use, so they're not self-establishing, right? And he's saying here in this previous page, they would be established for themselves, right? If things were existed intrinsically, they would be self-establishing. They wouldn't depend upon parts, they wouldn't depend upon labels, and they wouldn't depend upon cause and conditions. And that's part of the meaning of inherent establishment, or inherent existence. That things lack this kind of self-reliant quality because they rely upon cause and conditions, they rely upon parts, and they rely upon labels.
I'm unclear about things that exist without causes and conditions. Can you run through that?
Yeah, so the typical example or atypical example they give in Buddhist philosophy of that is empty space. And so what they say is that empty space, in the sense of just unobstructedness, doesn't depend upon some other factor, but it does depend upon parts. Like, so in other words, like they give the example, there's north and south, east and west, or there's, the 10 directions and so on. So it has parts, but it doesn't depend upon causes and conditions to give rise to it the way, a microphone or a chair.
Don't parts, aren't they equivalent to the conditions?
Yeah.
I mean, what's the difference between the conditions of being able to define empty space? That is, you need some relational definition of those two terms, at least. Isn't that reliant on parts?
That is reliant on parts, but it's not. They say causes and conditions means like it has a.
Oh, I'm sorry. Aren't those causes? Don't those things equate to causes? How do they not equate to causes? I mean, cause is not necessarily an active view, right?
I think part of the issue is that, this is in Buddhist philosophy actually, that, let me say it right. It's actually different kinds of phenomena. They talk about, there's the phrase, you'll know this phrase, how do I say it? Like all compounded phenomena are impermanent, right? It's one of the 4 seals of Buddhism, right?
Right.
So there are compounded and uncompounded phenomena. And so the idea is that compounded phenomena are impermanent, change moment by moment. This is just in general Buddhist philosophy, like not just in Majjhimaka. So like a compounded phenomena means it arose due to causing conditions, it changes instant by instant, each instant it doesn't abide for a second instant unchanged. So it's not impermanent means momentarily impermanent, and it will cease just simply from the cause. It doesn't need a separate cause to cease. If the cause that gave rise to it will lead to its cessation, like our body, for example. Our body arose due to causing conditions that will, and so on. And then there are uncompounded phenomena, and space, emptiness, and there are various uncompounded phenomena. And so the difference from Buddhist perspective is that one is uncompounded phenomena don't change instant by instant. They say they didn't arise due to cause and conditions, and you know, and they don't, yeah, and therefore they don't cease due to the cause that gave rise to them, so to speak, you know, in that sense, in the way that impermanent phenomena do.
So this is by definition, basically.
Yeah, so it's two categories of phenomena that they really differentiate as different types of phenomena, you know, and because that's their point. Is like, you know, space, you know, and emptiness also. They say it's not changing instant by instant because it's a mere negation. And so it's not that same kind of phenomena. So it doesn't arise due to cause and conditions in that sense. Yeah, that if you think back to that phrase, right? All compounded phenomena are impermanent. It's a certain kind of phenomena they're describing there. And so they're saying space is not that kind of phenomena. So it's really that, it's that whole definition of two kinds. And that goes back, that's not, I mean, Madhyamikas accept those two categories, but that goes back to the Abhidharma and so on. And all Buddhist schools accept that. So that's not unique to Abhidharma. So it's like, it's their way of analyzing two kinds of phenomena and saying they're both empty in the case of Madhyamikas, but so the Madhyamikas are accepting that categorization, which it comes from all Buddhist schools.
Is Buddha uncompounded phenomena?
What's that?
Buddha.
Buddha would be, that's an interesting question. Is Buddha an uncompounded phenomena? Because you'd have to say the Buddha's body is a compounded phenomenon, right? And the Buddha's speech is a compounded phenomenon because it arises due to, you know, sound waves or something. But then if you were to ask, like the Buddha, they in technical terms, there's a phrase they call this bhavavakakaya, which is the emptiness of the Buddha's mind. I think that would be, I've never heard I've never heard that question asked to a Lama specifically, it's bhavavakakaya, but I think that would be an uncompounded phenomenon, right, because it's an emptiness. So it depends which aspect of the Buddha, I guess. Because if you were talking about the what they call the rupakaya, the form body of a Buddha, then you'd have to say that's compounded, right? Because you have a relationship to it, and it arose. You know, the Buddha was born from what's her name? Queen. You know, Queen. I think her name was Maya Devi, or Queen Maya Devi, I think, and Father Shuddhodana, and so on. So there were clearly cause and conditions that was compounded. That body was compounded, you'd say, but the bhavavakakaya would be uncompounded.
So the point is permanence and unchangeability.
Yeah, and unchanging. Yeah, not changing instant by instant.
Now, if only in emptiness has an inherent existence, does that give rise to the risk of nihilism?
You said does only emptiness have inherent existence? Is that what you said?
I'm asking.
Good. Yeah. So first thing is from the some people say it does, but actually Prasangika Madhyamikas, following Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti, said actually, and even the Buddha in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, there's these different lists of categories of emptiness or something. The ways of, you know, they're all the same in the sense that they're all empty, but they do it for a reason. And part of the reason is what you're saying, that they make the point. One of the types of emptiness or categories of emptiness is emptiness. So they make the point, even emptiness is empty. And so there's a whole teaching, the emptiness of emptiness. So they would say emptiness also has no inherent existence, which is interesting. So they would say emptiness is an ultimate truth in the sense that it's the ultimate truth of phenomena, but it's not ultimately existent. It's conventionally existent. You know, in other words, it's not. You know, that it's not intrinsically existent. Let's put it that way. And they even say, like,
so what does its existence depend on our thinking?
There are a couple things. One is they say the emptiness, like, because emptiness is not a vague sort of thing out there somewhere. Emptiness is like, so for example, if you say, if I say the emptiness of my body, right? The emptiness, like my body is empty of inherent existence, right? So the emptiness of my body is dependent upon my body, actually. And then the emptiness of, the cushion is dependent upon the cushion. And then the emptiness of my body is dependent upon my body, actually. And then the emptiness of, the cushion is dependent upon the cushion. And then the emptiness of, the cushion is dependent upon the cushion. And then the emptiness of, the cushion is dependent upon the cushion. And then the emptiness of So, and, you know, yeah, so that's one way of describing it. And then another is that, like every other phenomenon, it exists, it does exist, but it exists in dependence upon, so that's the parts. You know, because I was saying, impermanent compounded phenomena have all three. They're dependent upon causes and conditions, parts, and a label. But emptiness is an uncompounded phenomenon, so it's only dependent upon the two. So the parts would be body, cushion, chair, car. You know, each thing has its own, you could say, has its own emptiness in some sense. They're all of the same taste, in a way, in the sense that they're all emptiness. But in terms of, one is in terms of, emptiness doesn't exist apart from those. There's not some other thing that's emptiness that exists out there, independent of phenomena. And then another is it's dependent upon the label. So that's what you were getting at, right? Yeah. Yeah, so it's dependent upon, because and it's interesting, isn't it? 'Cause from a Buddhist perspective, existence means, an existent phenomenon is that which can be known, right? And to be known, there's label, yeah.
Question. So, but can the parts be compound? Can the parts of uncompounded phenomena be compounded? Or it has to be all uncompounded, right? For it to.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Well, the parts of space are all uncompounded, yeah. And then I guess what's interesting is that, like, you know, when I say the emptiness, yeah, so the emptiness of my body is an uncompounded phenomenon. The emptiness of the chair is uncompounded. The emptiness of a table is an uncompounded. Yeah, so I think so. It has to be uncompounded.
So Buddha mind is permanent?
What's that?
Buddha mind is permanent?
Well, that's why I specified svabhavakakaya. So the emptiness of the Buddha's mind is, it doesn't change instant by instant. They would say actually, though, that the wisdom body, the omniscient mind of the Buddha, you would have to say is impermanent, wouldn't you? Actually, because it's each instant it's knowing all phenomena that exist, right? If it's omniscient, you know, that idea of a Buddha's Dharmakaya, the omniscient part of it, you know, so the omniscient part of the Buddha's mind, that knows all impermanent phenomena in each instant. So that would have to be impermanent, wouldn't it?
I don't know, that's a quality. That can be described easily as a quality, which doesn't change.
And I said, well, and part of the issue there, though, is like, I guess we have to differentiate, like, let's say this right, like, it's a quality, so it doesn't change. I guess what I'm getting at, though, is, let's say it right. What is mind?
As it unfolds, as it acts, it's impermanent.
Right.
Its actions are impermanent, but its nature.
That's what I guess I'm getting at, like, impermanent in that sense, that, like, I mean, the emptiness of a Buddha's mind is permanent, in a sense, not permanent, unchanging. I think it's a better, permanent is confusing, I think, because, for example, they would say, take the example of a Buddha's Sambhogakaya, right, enjoyment body, they translate that. That, they say, is impermanent, but will exist until the end of samsara. Right? So it's impermanent in the sense that it changes instant by instant, it moves, it talks, you know, teaches, they say it continually teaches the Mahayana. So it's impermanent in the sense that it's a functioning, another way of saying it is impermanent phenomena are functioning. And permanent, so it's a functioning phenomena that can perform functions. But, so I actually think that the omniscience of the Buddha's mind would be impermanent, but the emptiness of the Buddha's mind would be permanent. That's my own thinking. That's just my position, I don't know. Somebody else could debate that, I think.
Again, the omniscience is a quality, not an action. Right?
Oh, but part of it is that what it knows is different in each instant.
Because that's the action. But its ability to be.
It's a sort of.
Okay.
Yeah, it's interesting, because I guess we have to differentiate. They say Buddha's omniscience will never end, but it's interesting, something can, that's why I think the word permanence in English is a little confusing sometimes, Because really, in the Buddhist context, it means does it change instant by instant? Because there are things that that could change instant by instant, but it can have an eternal continuum. And so I think the Buddhist mind will have an eternal continuum, but that doesn't mean it's unchanging instant by instant. That's it.
But can compounded phenomena become uncompounded?
Can compounded phenomena become uncompounded?
Like it becomes no longer dependent on causes and conditions at some point, but still have parts and a label.
I think compounded phenomena. This gets into a very subtle point, actually. So I don't know if we should go there too much, but compounded phenomena change after the first instant, actually. You know, like and actually, one point would be, how do you say it the right way? Like, yeah, I don't know if it's good to get into this or not, but I'll just say it. Like, so I'll pick the example. Like, okay, if I had a friend and the friend died, right? So clearly, my friend was a compounded phenomenon, right? He or she was born, lived, moved around, ate, drank, and all that, right? So you would have to say they were compounded phenomena. But I think, like, I would say your question is interesting, isn't it? Because it would say, well, now they died, so are they uncompounded? That's an interesting question, right? Like, it's worth thinking about. I mean, I could get into it. I mean, there are different answers, I think, maybe from different philosophical schools, but it's an interesting question. One point, though, would be, actually, I'll say this, though. Like, the reason why I would say there's, like, if you think, first of all, of their body, like, the person is labeled on the body and the mind, right? So their body, the material that was once their body, is now all over the place, though, right? But it's actually still matter, so it's still compounded, right? So you can't say the material that once was their body, all the atoms that were once their body, now may be part of plants and part of trees and part of the air and part of, depending how they were cremated or whatever. But like, so you can't say that the particles that once made up their body are not uncompounded. They're parts of all different other phenomena now, so they're compounded. And then the mind, the mental continuum, right? Well, you would say, well, if they took rebirth somewhere, then now they're some other being. So that's not an uncompounded phenomenon. So actually, if you think of it that way, you would have to say, well, the body, the phenomenon, what was once labeled that person, the material part would now be labeled other phenomena, and the mind would be labeled some other person. So they wouldn't be uncompounded in that sense. That's my own thinking on that.
What's the status of the label?
That's the part I was trying to avoid a little bit, because I know that gets into that whole thing about, which we've had discussions about before, about Majjhimaka, specifically the Prasangika Majjhimaka view on that, on memory and on, it's related to those points, which is that's the part I was trying to avoid, actually, because it's a very, very subtle topic. Let's wait until Lama Tsongkhapa gets to that, because I think otherwise we'll lose track of where we're focusing. Okay. So next, Lama Tsongkhapa quotes Nagarjuna. First, his root text on wisdom. It says, whatever arises dependent upon something is not that thing for a while. Or you could say is not, I like this translation, I found another one, is not one with what it depends upon. I think that's a more clear meaning, so I'm going to say it that way. Whatever arises dependent upon something is not one with what it depends upon. Neither is it inherently other than what it depends upon. Hence, it is not annihilated and not permanent. Well, and actually, I skipped actually a paragraph. That's what. So before that, I said if something arises dependently and is labeled dependently, right? So we're getting at the second two types of dependent origination, right? But you remember the first type I said was dependent on causing conditions, parts, and label, right? So here he's saying if something arises dependently and is labeled dependently, It does not exist as something that is established by way of its own entity as one with whatever it depends upon. If it did exist at one, all actions and agents would be one. So first of all, let's pause there. Does that make sense? Like, in other words, if you said, actually it gets at what we were already talking about, right? Like, that we have to be able to differentiate between the basis of designation, meaning the parts, right? Actually, so you see, the dependent origination means there's a basis of designation, which are parts. Then there's a designation, a label, right? That's a kind of dependent origination, right? And so what he's saying is, and the thing that I'm labeling is not identical with the parts, right? And this is a common meditation, and I mean, many of you have meditated on this kind of thing, but you know, intuitively we don't recognize that as part of, I just want to pause for a second here, right? Like, actually, if I, you know, if you, like, I'm trying to think of an example, like, if I saw, if I opened up a Facebook and I saw a photo of half of Jodi's face, like, you know, like someone to take a photo like that, I would say, oh, that's Jodi, right? But of course, is Jodi identical to half of Jodi's face? Obviously not, right? And so if we're just using language, like if in other words, on the one hand, if I recognize that's my friend Jodi and I just label it, that's a valid, it's not incorrect, right? It's a valid, but if I'm doing ultimate analysis here, one point is, you know, the phenomena, in that case Jodi, is not identical to parts. And part of what we're getting at here is if a phenomena were identical to its parts, right? First of all, there are all kinds of flaws that would happen, right? One is then you'd have there are many parts and only one phenomena, so you'd have many, we've already gone through that, right? There'd be all these, so then you'd have, then, you know, then if you were to say, well, Jodi's identical to each of her parts, then there'd be like countless Jodis, right? Because she has a lot of cells and subatomic particles. And you say, oh, there are an infinite number of Jodis, that doesn't make any sense. But also, here he's saying, if something arises dependently and is labeled dependently, it does not exist as something established by way of its own entity, as one with whatever it depends upon. Right? I'm just pausing there, because there are, another point here, right, there are many levels on which you could look at this, actually, right, to understand dependent arising and the reasoning here. One is, he's talking now about parts, but I want to actually step back for a second. Let's start a simpler one, causes and conditions, right? So, in other words, you arose, some of the causes and conditions for you to arise were your parents, food, water, and so on, right? But if we were to say, here he's saying, well, at one point, he's not saying this, but one is, if you were identical to the causes, you would say, well, you know, actually, so you are your mother, so that you are your father, like, which of course is not literally true, is it? And the other problem is, if you say that, then if you say you are your mother, then you're not, how about your dad? If you say you are your dad, then how about your mom? And then you can't leave out all the food and drink and so on, education and all these other factors, right? So we have to recognize you can't say you're one with the causes that give rise to you, but what he's going to say in the next paragraph is you also can't say you're inherently other than them, right? Because you arise in dependence upon them. Therefore, there's no inherent arising. Right? And then the same goes for the parts, right? In other words, there are all these parts that make something up, and based upon those parts, you label a phenomena. But the phenomena is not identical to any one of the parts. And this is Chandrakirti gives us a great detail about this. The phenomena is, you know, and it's not the mere collection of the parts, right? And he often gives the famous example of a chariot, but you could use a car, right? Because if you came out to your driveway and there were all the parts of your car laying around, you wouldn't say, you know, oh great, there's my car. You would say, what the hell happened? You know, right? So it's not the mere collection of the parts, and so on. You know, and then when the parts are sort of arranged in a certain way, and then you label it, and it exists, right? So you start to get the sense of this, right? So it's not, if it's not one with the parts, but it's not independent of the parts, this is the ultimate analysis, right? Then it doesn't intrinsically exist. It doesn't exist from its own side. It doesn't exist independently of, what's the word? A mere appearance and designation. Does that make sense? And therefore, that's what he's saying. So it doesn't exist by way of its own entity. It doesn't exist intrinsically, right? That's one meaning of dependent arising. It's very subtle, isn't it? That's a subtle kind of dependent arising. That's more subtle than, you see why I started with the parents. The parents is more obvious. This is more subtle, isn't it? And so then he says, and then he says what I said. The two also do not exist as different, established by way of their own entities, because if they did, one could refute their relation. So they're so you couldn't say, so in other words, on the one hand, you can't say that the person is any one part or is the mere collection of parts, but you also can't say the person exists independently of those, right? And so this is how dependent origination, as he says here, refutes also truly established oneness and difference through this same line of reasoning of dependent origination. So now we can understand this next verse where he says, Nagarjuna says, whatever arises depending upon something is not one with what it depends upon, neither is it inherently other than what it depends upon. It is not annihilated, nor is it permanent. Right? So now it is not one with what it. So you see, and here I just want to pause, right? This is why I did that thing. You can do that in relation to either of those ways of analyzing dependent arising. Nagarjuna's statement here, you could do it in the context of causes and conditions, right? It's not one with the causes and conditions that gave rise to it, but it's also not inherently other than those, right? Or you can do it based on the parts, right? It's not inherently one with. It's harder, isn't it? You can see why it's subtler. And then the labeling is the most subtle. And you start to get a sense it's easy. So you have to start. I'm just doing it slowly because it's actually useful to start with the cause and conditions one. Does that make sense? Because it's easier to cognize, right? Like, because you could easily see, well, if you ask yourself, well, am I one with my parents? No, right? Am I inherently separate from them? No, right? I mean, actually, you could look at it, if you do a DNA test, it's easy to figure that out, right? You're not inherently other than them, but you're not one with them, right? But then, it's subtler, isn't it? If you start to analyze the same way, but then if the parts would be actually your own, you could do your own DNA. Right? Are you inherently one with your own DNA? Right? Well, actually, then how could it be that some of it belong to, if they do a DNA test, some of it belongs to, some person you never met, who lives in another state, right, or another country. So your DNA, parts of your DNA are identical to some other person, right? That's how they can match and say, oh, this is your second cousin once removed or something, right? So it's interesting, isn't it? So your DNA is not yours. It's not one with you, in other words. But you don't exist independently of it either, do you? I'm just using DNA as the example here. Obviously, Nagarjuna wasn't using DNA. But you get the point, right? That's the parts, So then, based upon this mere, conglomeration, then you label me, and that's correct. But there's nothing intrinsically there. Even your DNA, there's nothing intrinsic in your DNA that's intrinsically you, is there? DNA isn't made up of parts, isn't it? Proteins are made up of parts. Right? And the proteins that make up your body, right? On the one hand, do you exist independently of those? No. Right? On the other hand, everybody else has the same proteins. Right? Identical proteins. So just giving examples here, right? So you don't exist independently of those, but you're not one with those. Right? So, and then next, also, the praise of the transcendent one is also by Nagarjuna. He says, logicians assert that suffering is created by, okay, this is what that one. It says, logicians assert that suffering is created by itself or other, or by both itself and other, or that it is without a cause. You said, meaning the Buddha, you, the Buddha, said, it arises dependently. That which arises in interdependence is asserted by you as empty. Things do not exist independently. That is your matchless lion's roar. So this is, again, a very profoundly complicated verse, but one thing, though, right, is that he's praising the Buddha, actually, right? And, you know, in praise to the Buddha for teaching dependent origination, Lama Tsongkhapa makes a very similar praise, right? Where he says, you know, he says basically, if you really want to praise the Buddha for this, for teaching dependent origination, because it's totally unique. And it's the one thing that leads to liberation. And so here, Nagarjuna is contrasting the Buddha with other philosophers, right? And so actually, essentially, when he says logicians, he's meaning other Indian philosophers, actually, there he's talking about. And actually, I wrote down some notes to remind ourselves. Like, so, logicians assert that suffering, so he's saying some people will say suffering arises from itself. Some people will say suffering arises from something intrinsically other than it. Some will say it arises from both. Some will say it arises from neither. In ancient India, it was the, I'll just go through very briefly, it was the Samkhyas who said things arise from themselves. Actually, but you meet people like this, actually, that they don't call themselves Samkhyas. But the way they would say it is that things arise from their own nature. And actually, you meet people like that, where they say, like, you know, they'll say, oh, it's the nature of that thing or that person to be that way, you know. And then who says it arises from other? Actually, most Buddhist schools say phenomena arise from other, and that they both intrinsically exist. The cause intrinsically exists, the effect intrinsically exists. So many Buddhist schools would assert that. The Jains assert that, you know, Jains? Jain? I didn't have to say that, I always forget. Or sometimes, yeah, anyway, the followers of Mahavira, right, who was the founder of Jainism, asserted that things arise from both self and other. Right? And sometimes they give this example where they say, well, like a pot, that the pot arises from itself in the sense that it was the clay, and the potter is other than the pot. And so from itself and other, then the pot arises. Right? So they would say that position. And then who says it arises without a cause? I think sometimes modern Americans say that. But in ancient India, it was actually the ones the Buddhists kind of most looked down upon, the Charvakas, or the nihilists. I think sometimes our culture is a nihilistic culture, actually. Western American culture is somewhat nihilistic at times. Well, sometimes it's permanent, too. So there's a sense, sometimes they'll say also it arises from other. Actually, some people in a modern society, right, will say it arises from nothing, right, kind of nihilistically, right? Others will say it all comes from God, right? So it's other, right? There's an other who produces everything, right? So there are many different positions of where things come from. And then, so Nagarjuna is here saying, but only and actually this is quite true, isn't it? That only the Buddha actually asserts this, what he says here, that things arise dependently, and that which arises in interdependence is empty. Right? That's a unique position of Buddhism. That's quite true. So, and he's saying that's the lion's roar of Buddhism, of the Buddha. So then he says here, through the argument of dependent arising, the apprehensions of oneness and of difference of the extreme of permanence and annihilation, and of the four extremes of origination are thus said to be refuted. So what he's getting at is this. Actually, he's saying many points here. One is, if you understand dependent arising, right? He's actually, it's like I don't know what you could say, it's like an advertisement for dependent arising. So, you know, what are the benefits? You know? So he's gone through them, actually. He's saying, if you understand dependent arising, the most important thing is you'll understand emptiness. Right? If you understand dependent arising, as I said earlier, just that, the dependent will overcome permanence, the arising will overcome nihilism, and you'll be free from the two extremes. Then he's saying, not only that, but if you understand emptiness, you'll understand that things don't, there's a whole point, that things won't exist, that you'll understand, through this understanding of dependent arising, you'll come to a realization that things are not one with their causes, but are not inherently other than their causes. You'll understand the meaning of unarisen. That's the real meaning of unarisen, right? And you'll understand that things aren't one with their parts, but don't exist independently of their parts. The things aren't one with their label, but don't exist independently of the label. Right? Not only that, but you'll understand that things don't arise from themselves, from other, from both, or from neither. That's the four, right, that he says here, the four extremes of origination. So you'll understand the meaning of unoriginated in that sense, right? That unoriginated, now you can understand, it doesn't mean they don't arise at all, but it means if they don't arise from something that's intrinsically themselves, or intrinsically other, or both, or neither, then they're not intrinsically arisen, right? They're merely labeled as arisen, or designated as arisen, based upon causes and conditions, right? And parts, and so on. So he's saying all these things will be realized by realizing dependent arising. Does that make sense? Now he says, having thus induced certainty through the emptiness that is being empty of all focal objects of an apprehension of signs, one does not give up one's ascertainment of the relation between actions and their effects. And he's saying, again, Lama Tsongkhapa said this kind of thing earlier in this book, but here he's saying it very clearly, right? He's saying, if you can't understand causality in the context of emptiness, and emptiness in the context of causality, of cause and effect, then you don't understand emptiness. Right? That's what he's saying there, right? And he's saying, when you induce a certainty understanding emptiness, and this reinforces your care with regard to causality, actually, well, then he quotes Nagarjuna's Bodhicitta Varana, essay on bodhicitta, right, or text on bodhicitta, that says, relying on actions and their effects while knowing this emptiness of phenomena, this is more wonderful still than the wonderful. This is more marvelous still than the marvelous. And so that's an essential point. Right? If you understand dependent arising as the meaning of emptiness, then your understanding of emptiness will have the opposite effect of nihilism, won't it? You'll become more and more careful about karma, actually. You'll become more and more careful about your relationships to others, because you'll recognize, well, all things depend upon causes and conditions, and whatever causes and conditions I give rise to is going to bring about non-inherently existent but experienced effects. Right? And actually, an inherently existent effect would never be experienced. In other words, and that's what you start to understand, right? If you understand emptiness, you understand, other philosophical schools think that something has to exist inherently to be experienced and to have efficacy. But actually, something that exists in and of itself wouldn't be dependently originated, so I couldn't have a relationship to it and couldn't experience it. What I'm going to experience, the effects of my own actions, I'll experience them because I don't inherently exist and the effect won't inherently exist. And so there's a relationship, right? And that relationship is not inherently one and not inherently other, and therefore will give rise to happiness or suffering experiences, causally, right? Due to causal dependent origination, due to dependent relationship. And so what he's saying here is like, that's the sign of a correct understanding or correct, what is the word he used? A correct certainty with regards to emptiness, is when you're, and he's saying that here, and actually I'll just read it again because there's one point I left out in terms of just explaining. He says, having induced certainty through the emptiness that is being empty of all focal objects of an apprehension of signs. So what he's saying there is this, just to make it totally clear, right? What he's saying is if you're sitting in meditation, right, and you're analyzing this point about dependent origination, right, there will come a point where you've identified the object of negation, inherent established I, right? And then you're recognizing that, for example, that the I is not one with the parts, but doesn't exist as one with the parts, but doesn't exist independently of the parts. Right? And if you keep meditating on it, there will come a point where you'll have you'll induce a certainty, as using his words, that that object of negation doesn't exist, right? That there is no independent, intrinsic I. And experientially in that moment, you'll have an experience that they call sometimes space-like emptiness, right? In which you'll just be, your mind will be completely absorbed in this recognition that the object of negation, the inherent existent I, doesn't exist at all. And so he says, empty of all focal objects of apprehension of signs. So in that moment, you won't have any object, no, there will be nothing else appearing to your mind except the mere absence of that object of negation, the inherently existent I. But you'll know, right, that as you arise from that, you'll know, well, you weren't negating mere appearances, you were negating the object of negation, right? Inherently existent I. How did you negate it? Through understanding dependent origination, right? So he says, so when you arise from that, you will not give up your ascertainment of the relationship between actions and their effects. Does that make sense? You won't have negated so much that you think there's no causality. And so you'll be able to have a harmony of your understanding of emptiness and your understanding of interdependence. That's what he's saying. And actually, I'll go on and say the next point here because it's very related. He says, for that to happen, right, he's explaining now. He's saying, for that to happen, it is necessary to differentiate between inherent existence and mere existence. And it's also necessary to differentiate between non-existence by way of its own character and total non-existence. And so this is what I started with actually today, so it's good. Now go towards the end, I'll focus on it again. So he's saying you have to be able, if you're going to do this, and this is what I was getting at earlier when I said unborn, that phrase where I said, you know, that which is born due to cause and conditions is unborn, right? Which I said, oh, my friend got very, I said, my friend was saying, what the heck does that mean? Like, of course I was born. Which I always like directness like that. But, okay, so what he's saying here is what? Is inherent existence is not the same, doesn't mean the same thing as mere existence, or existence in general, right? That's what I started with. And non-existence by way of its own character doesn't mean total non-existence. And if you can't differentiate those things, you're not going to understand. That's what he's saying. If you want to be able to understand emptiness correctly and have this experience of a harmony of dependent origination and emptiness, he says for that to happen, you must be able to differentiate these things, right? And that's where when you read no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, you don't think that means like, oh, I never had any eyeballs or something, right? You know, I never, like, you know what he's saying is the eyes are dependently originated. So they lack any inherent nature. And that's how they exist, right? The ears lack any inherent, arose due to causing conditions, have parts, are merely labeled on the parts, lack any inherent nature, and that's how they exist. You know, they do exist conventionally, but not ultimately, and so on. Right? So we have to, and then when you realize things lack any inherent existence, we don't think they don't exist at all, right? You have to differentiate those points. Does that make sense? Otherwise, you get them all mixed up, and when you refute inherent existence, you think nothing exists. And when you think, oh, but things do exist, you think they exist by way of their own nature. Does that make sense? So if you can't differentiate those points, then you'll never be able to come to this harmony of dependent origination and emptiness. So then he quotes Chandrakirti. What wise person, while knowing the presentation of causes and effects, reflections without inherent existence, would observe to merely exist those forms, feelings, and so forth that do not exist other than as causes and conditions, and thereby ascertain them as possessing inherent existence. Therefore, although observed to exist, they do not inherently exist. Right? And so you're getting the point there. One point is, you know, things are observed to exist, and that's not being refuted, but they don't inherently exist. Chandrakirti clearly says that. And then, you know, here, we did a whole section on this, I'm not going to dwell on too long, but Chandrakirti again uses the phrase, Chandrakirti here uses the phrase reflections, right? So he's giving an example like a reflection, which we went through remember there was a whole section on examples like an illusion. Right? And so he's just giving that example, right? When you see your reflection in the mirror, I'll just remind you of that point. When you see your reflection in the mirror, right, the reflection undeniably appears to you, right? And yet, there's no face in the mirror, right? There's no inherent existence of a face there, right? And that's an example, right? That's the example used because it's easier to understand to say things can appear to us without inherent existence, without inherent nature, and that's how all things appear, is what Chandrakirti is saying. He's using the example of a reflection in a mirror to make a point about how the nature of how all things exist to us. And then he explains further, Lama Tsongkhapa explains further. If you do not differentiate between those four, right, so what are the four? Inherent existence versus existence, lack of existence by way of its own nature or character, and complete non-existence, right? Those are the four things he's differentiating. He says, if you do not differentiate those four, things will exist by way of their own entity as soon as they exist. And they will be non-existent as long as they do not exist by way of their own entity. You will not move beyond the two extremes of superimposition and deprecation. And part of what Lama Tsongkhapa was getting at here, which I don't want to go on too long again because it's not like we're not doing tenets, but all other Buddhist, all non-Buddhist schools and all other Buddhist schools, actually, they would say, don't differentiate those points. Only the Prasangika, from Lama Tsongkhapa's perspective, only the Prasangika Madhyamaka system of philosophy following Chandrakirti is able to make that very subtle distinction between that things can exist without inherently existing, and things can lack inherent, can be empty of existence by way of its own character, but not totally non-existent. And then again, and here he quotes Aryadeva. According to those who propound that real substantial things exist, as long as things exist, so long will an own entity exist in accordance with it. Whereas when it is rid of its own entity, the thing will no longer exist in any way, and will therefore resemble a donkey's horn, a tonal non-existent, right? Therefore, since they do not pass beyond propounding those two, all their assertions only match with difficulty. And one is they sometimes use a rabbit's horn or a donkey's horn. I guess the idea there is like, because an animal that can have big ears, sometimes from a distance a person can think it has horns, right? But then if you get closer, you see there's no horn there. So talking about a non-existent thing. But what he's saying really is that if you can't differentiate these points, which is really what we've already been saying though, but that you won't be able to, you'll get stuck in in the two extremes, right? The extreme of nihilism or eternalism, and you won't be able to have this harmony of understanding that emptiness doesn't refute appearance and mere existence. And mere existence doesn't refute emptiness. They're in harmony, they're not opposed. And that's why, so he says, we'll only match with difficulty, that other schools have a hard time matching those things up. But the Madhyamaka Prasangika school can match them up because of this harmony of dependent origination and emptiness. That being so, you are freed from all extremes of existence through the absence of existence by way of its own entity. And within that, from all extremes of non-existence through the ability to posit causes and effects without inherent existence. Any questions there? Just pause again. Check. It's really easy, right? Actually, it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because can you feel that? I just want to pause and ask, like, it's really an interesting, very subtle point, I think he's making, right? Cause and effect, how did he say it? Posit causes and effects without inherent existence. Because, like, what he's saying in a way is non-Buddhists, but even all other Buddhist schools, other than the Prasangika, they want to say, well, like, for a thing to give rise to an effect, it must exist from its own side, intrinsically. How can it give rise to an effect if it doesn't? They would feel to them it feels like, right, well, you can't say, like, if something doesn't exist from its own side, how could it possibly give rise to an effect? If it doesn't exist intrinsically, you could see how they could feel that, right? The thing has to exist intrinsically to give rise to effect. And then what the Prasangika is saying is, if a thing exists intrinsically, it couldn't possibly give rise to an effect. See, it's the exact opposite on that one point. It's a very subtle distinction. And there are many points of debate, like where, for example, like people say to Nagarjuna. There's a point in some of Nagarjuna's texts where he sort of describes his own debates, right? And he says people will say that to him. They'll say, well, you're saying things are empty, so then there's no such thing as suffering or happiness or karma. And then Nagarjuna says, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, you're asserting things exist inherently, so according, if that were true, there would be no suffering or happiness or karma. Because things are empty, everything's possible. Because emptiness is true, all things are true. Because emptiness is possible, all things are possible. This is a famous line from Nagarjuna. So, Nagarjuna himself had this kind of debate with people where they would think, but something has to have an intrinsic nature to give rise to an effect. And Nagarjuna is saying, again, if something had an intrinsic nature, then that's its own nature in and of itself, so how could it participate in giving rise to an effect? It's this thing that exists apart, independently, by itself. Right? And Nagarjuna is saying nothing exists independently, intrinsically by itself. Everything exists relationally. Right?
How is it again that something that does not exist inherently, something that exists inherently cannot give rise to an effect? What is the logic of that? Something that exists inherently cannot give rise to an effect.
They give examples of that, like let's see. Something that exists inherently cannot give rise to an effect. Part of it is because something that exists inherently can't have. What's the way to say this right? Like, you have to really contemplate how does it. If a thing exists inherently, how does it exist? That's really the hard part, isn't it? That Lama Tsongkhapa is sort of exploring here. Because if a thing existed inherently, how would it exist, right? Like, so if you, like, for example, like if you existed inherently, right, Jeff, right, then you would have to be one with your parts or separate from your parts, right? And we use that example here. So let's assume, let's assume that you exist as one with your parts. If you took that position, right, Jeff exists as one with his parts, right? Well, then your parts are you intrinsically, right?
Right.
And you're your parts intrinsically.
Right.
So then, you have to really contemplate deeply. How could you have a son?
What is the mechanism by which that entity can't act? I still don't get what is inherent in not being able to act because of that condition.
I'm using a simplistic example for a second of having a son, right? Well, if you are inherently one with your parts, right, then if some of your parts went into your son, right, then how can that be? Then he's you, because you're one with your parts. So then he has to be identical with you, and then there are two of you, because you're inherently one with your parts. You're not dependent upon your parts. You're not labeled upon your parts. You're intrinsically one with your parts, right? So how could a part of you separate from you and become something else? That part is intrinsically and inherently you.
So you get cloning?
Yeah. Then the clone would have to be you, though, with the same name, same history, same. Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it?
It is.
Because you're inherently one with your parts. You're in, what's the word? Those parts should be inseparable, should be self-substantiating. They can't separate out and produce some other thing.
Would that
Because
invalidate the existence of the subject to begin with, if that happened?
Yeah, that's the problem, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, it's a bad example, though. You said a simple example, but so I have father to son, So I still have my sperm hasn't gone, it's simply, it's regenerated, right? And the nature of that part is I still have my sperm, right? I haven't lost anything in that example. Nothing has separated from me, has it?
A piece of your DNA.
The DNA is still there.
At one point, they're calling, this particular spermatozoa you, and in another instance,
Right,
not you.
I understand that.
So is it you or is it not you? Yeah. I mean, you could even get the example of food, for example. Like before you ate dinner last night, was that food you or not you?
All food is
So those are the causes and conditions, right?
Yeah.
The food and the fact that the sperm can regenerate based on causes and conditions themselves.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's the difference between inherent nature and
Dependent nature. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the former cannot give, right?
Yeah.
The inherent nature cannot give.
No, it can't
So you
give
cannot
and it can't
have- You cannot
receive.
have generosity or compassion.
Right. Can't give, can't
Isn't that
receive.
interesting?
Can't, yeah, exactly.
So how is acting the same as exporting my sperm? So how is being able to act on something to create an effect? How is it? What's the similarity of logic there?
So part of it is also this, is that, like, if you exist, what do we say, intrinsically, inherently, then you don't exist, let's see this right, you don't exist relatively, right? Those are two mutually exclusive categories. And so you don't exist relation. It's actually a part of it. I think one way they would use this term, but one way I would use it is inherent existence would be non-relational. Actually, is part of what they're getting at. If something existed inherently and intrinsically by its own nature, it wouldn't arise due to causes and conditions, right? And it wouldn't be like so for that it wouldn't be. It would be non-relational actually.
Where does that statement come from?
I think from the Guardian actually, but I mean, I think like let's see where like if I go back, I should use it. Like so here he says. I'm trying to find the exact quote. I'll read this quote. So I'm going back to a quote from a few pages earlier from. Well, I'll use this one actually too. So there are two quotes that get at this point. The first one is Chandra Kirti. He says, "Since things arise in utter mutual dependence, these conceptions cannot be imputed. Through this reasoning of dependent arising, all the net of bad views are therefore cut. Or the net of bad views is therefore cut." Right? Utter mutual dependence is what he's saying is the nature of things. And then the other quote here is from Aryadeva. He says, "That which has dependent origin does not have independence, or does not exist under its own power. All these things don't have independence, hence the self does not exist." So what he's getting at there is that interdependence, right? He's saying it very clear. Interdependence and independence are mutually exclusive categories, right? So a thing has to its nature has to either be that it's interdependent or independent, right? And so if a thing has its own nature, he's saying, then that's what they're saying, then it exists. Its nature of existence is independent, and independent means not relational, actually, right? It means it's not existing dependent upon and relational to causes, effects,
I can
parts.
see that it implies no cause and effect.
But you were saying it has to, how can it not give rise to an effect? So then that.
Those are two different things.
Wait, how are cause and effect different from giving rise to an effect?
Because one is creation through cause and effect. Basta. Right? I exist. Cause and effect. Then not being able to have an effect. They're not the same thing.
So you mean like your position would be like that, like you arose due to cause.
No, I
I'm a
was
little
no
confused
cause
by it.
and effect. I'm independent.
So you're saying you arose due to no causes or conditions, but you can give rise to effects.
You said before that the logic was that if I exist without causes and conditions, et cetera, I cannot have an effect. And all I'm doing is asking the question, why? Why? What of that state says that I can't act? That I
Oh, I
can't
see what
have
you're
an
saying.
effect on, even though I wasn't created by all those around me, how can I not have an effect on, how can I not have a relation?
Oh, I see. You're asking a slightly different question than I thought. Yeah, actually, the response to your question, I just find this funny. The response to your question actually would be, I was just reading this the other day, would be actually like, Dharma Kirti actually addresses this in his Reputations of God. Because there's, actually, I mean, the assertion you're, for our purposes, making is of being like God, actually, right? Of like God the creator. You're saying I'm God, like, you're taking the position that you're like God the creator, right? That you arose through no, which is many Indian schools would say, something that rose due to no cause and conditions but can give rise to effects. In that sense, I mean, right, a thing that arose without any causes and conditions to give rise to it is inherently existent but can give rise to effects, that's what you're kind of asserting in this argument. Not that you're literally saying you're God, but for the purposes of discussion, that's what you're saying. I think. Is that correct?
I don't quite see it, but I can see how I can see how you can get there.
Well, and part of what Dharma Kirti, if I remember, I was just reading it recently, but part of what he points out is that, like, if you were to assert what you're saying, right, like, then in any given moment when you decide, like, so if you decide I'm going to give rise to this effect, right, like, you can't have made that decision independently, or is that decision arose in dependence upon causes and conditions. So the you of that instant does exist dependent upon causes and conditions. It's part of what, in other words, the decision to act, right? There is the being who's making a decision to act is making that decision in dependence upon causes and conditions. So they actually already, it's already proven that they exist dependent upon causes and conditions. That's what Dharma Kirti is saying. If something actually existed completely in this kind of independent way, then it would have to be permanent and unchanging. And that if it's making decisions to act based on causes and conditions and changing circumstances, then it's changing each instant, which means it's dependent upon the previous instant and dependent upon all the causes and conditions that led it to decide to act. So those are mutually contradictory assertions, is what he says in that part. I mean, he's saying it about God, but we could say it about any being that would say, if any being were to think, I exist independently, but I've decided in this moment to give rise to an effect. Like, its nature of existing in an instant where it's deciding to give rise to an effect is clearly dependently originated, because if we're actually, what's there to say? Yeah, otherwise it would be permanent and unchanging.
So the very act of volition is the flaw.
Yeah, it's dependently, implies or it necessitates dependence.
Another good example, I think, that just occurred to me, is that of the bodhisattva concept. So, in order for the bodhisattva to exist, she has to come back into existence, take rebirth, right? In order to continue to be able to help others, compassion, love, and so forth. But otherwise, if it just went into absolute nirvana cannot do any of
You're right, yeah.
that. You know?
And I think that's one, or a quick response. I agree with you. And also, I think one thing that's quite interesting is like, sometimes in the, in some of the individual liberation vehicle, right, teachings, they'll kind of describe nirvana,
Theravada.
Theravada, yeah. They'll describe nirvana as a kind of an escape, essentially. To some, different schools describe it differently. Some talk kind of nothing, almost like kind of an annihilation, like a candle. There's the one metaphor they use, like a candle blown out or something of that sort. But in the Mahayana, actually, there's no idea like that, is there? Because the idea is that emptiness, first of all, is not separate from phenomena, right? It's the nature of phenomena. Form is emptiness. Emptiness is form, right? And the bodhisattva, in a sense, as you're describing, right? Their aspiration is to be more and more present, right, with an understanding of emptiness, And then, if you think of like a Buddha, right, they're kind of, the idea is that they're not escaping. I mean, they're escaping suffering in that sense, but they're not going into some kind of annihilation. They're becoming infinitely and compassionately present.
Are they escaping suffering, or have they transformed it?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, they themselves, right, actually, I mean, their subjective experience, though, is some kind of bliss, right? Blissful freedom that's infinitely present to others through compassion, though. That's important. I think that's what you're getting at, in part, right?
If you ask Thich Nhat Hanh, he would say that Buddha still would have some suffering.
Oh, interesting.
At least, the historical Buddha. But that's a whole other...
Yeah, Lama Tsongkhapa would disagree with that point, but yeah.
It would take it a bit far afield.
The Lama Tsongkhapa's position would be, they say anybody on the 8th bhumi or above is free from suffering, says the fruit. But, so the Buddha's beyond that. But that's a different position philosophically, but it's the same.
Right.
But it's a similar point, I think, about, yes, you're not escaping to some other place, though. Or, that's, I think, similar. I know we went over a little bit, so let's stop. But, mark where we left off.
The lion's roar.
So we left off with the lion's roar. Okay, so let's do the dedication. The supreme jewel bodhicitta, for it has not arisen, may it arise and grow, but has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara is dead.